Nearly 30 years ago, I did a week's intensive training in Gestalt therapy as part of a postgraduate diploma in transpersonal psychology. And I've just come across something I wrote a few pages long, which is a critique of Gestalt, or certainly my experience of it. And the context was that I was going through a period of time where I was under a lot of stress doing the training and seemed to hit a point where I was very open to what people were thinking and feeling, and whether it was psychic or psychotic, I'm not really sure. But anyway, this is what I wrote at the time. So, critique of Gestalt. There are two main connected agendas for the Gestalt therapist, with a system of techniques to both facilitate and hide them. The first is around the therapist's shadow projections, and the second is around feeding on pockets of retroflective energy. The first agenda does two things. It gives the therapist a phony, temporary sense of movement within his own process, and it also helps to make empathic links which facilitate connection prior to feeding. The second agenda replicates a sense of orchestration of his own psyche and fills a gap caused by a loss of connection with his self. The dominant subpersonality or component in the therapist's psyche is a skilled, adapted or full self who feeds off the life energy of the client in a quite loathsome way. Both agendas are quick fixes that need to be repeated owing to their essentially bogus and unsatisfying nature. 1. First agenda, empathic projections. These may be unacknowledged or unacceptable aspects of the therapist which are projected onto the client, having dug around to find a good enough hook or match. Unacceptability is not the primary requirement, however, though if it carries a charge of shame, the therapist's job will be easier. Perhaps the best analogy would be to see the therapist in a superego role and to see them as trying to control, label, manipulate, and trap free energies within the client. The possibility energies that come from a fluid connection with one's authentic self on some level, such as body, feelings, mind, etc. It is the formative and in-process nature of these psychic contents that both challenge the superego therapist and also attract him. In long-term work, an assessment is a useful tool in targeting vulnerable areas, those with a squirm value, though a skilled therapist will simply pick on shame, pleasure or anxiety in the moment and use softening up interventions to prioritise areas worth exploring. Almost any sentence the client constructs will have a charge or accent on one of the words that will lead to a vulnerable and formative area. If stuck, find a strong and solid part and find the polarity. Alongside the matching up, like playing snap to find an area in the client that the therapist wants to work on, and softening up, are the use of invitations to establish the therapist's dominance and his right to prioritise and lead the work. It must be understood that the client will usually cooperate with the therapist's agendas, as being used in these ways by parent figures is familiar to many clients. One payoff being a lessening of anxiety to be in a situation where the rules are familiar. The client intuitively understands that his role is to be supportive to the therapist in a codependent venture. For both clients and therapists, a clear understanding of their respective roles is only just below the liminal threshold, and it is possible to get a clear sense of the real transaction when observing a session by reading I as you and you as I when either parties speak. It is startling to observe how the real agendas come into sharp focus when this is tried, and also to observe the wry humour of the client in particular. Non-cooperative clients will either be shamed into cooperation or, if that's not achievable, pathologized and left to their sad destiny. The polarizing between the okay therapist and the not okay client who holds the therapist's shadow traits can even lead to a good conclusion for the client. It can be useful to have a therapist who holds a client's superego or driver or manipulator or abuser because, apart from the above-mentioned comfort of familiarity, it allows the client to experience not having to hold that part for himself. Paradoxically, to be continually cast in an unacceptable role can help a client who feels alienated, because being judged is equated with love by some clients. Therapists who are finding a level of self-acceptance and self-nurturing can also be very helpful, though they will usually knock the client back in order to redeem themselves yet again through the client. Another useful, if drastic, technique is simply for the therapist to talk most of the time. The client, deprived of the opportunity to process the material stirred up, will become blocked with retroflections and eventually break down in a process similar to sleep deprivation. This process takes some time, and both client and therapist usually reach the final stage without realizing that it is the therapist who needs to take a break. Second agenda, feeding. Found most frequently in depth psychology and Gestalt and already touched on above, the need to feed has given rise to a large number of creative techniques in Gestalt, which is essentially a shallow style lacking a sustained approach to the heights and depths of other therapies, at least more creative in technique but more destructive in terms of the energy-holding psychic structures that are smashed in a session. At best, in terms of style and elan, Gestalt can provide a sort of choreographed rape that is as elegant as a piece of music, cf. Clockwork Orange. Gestalt therapists have usually developed feeding activity patterns comparable to openings in chess. It can be clearly observed that on the completion of a feeding cycle or Gestalt, there is a switching off of interest on behalf of the therapist that seems to be surfeit, mixed with some disgust. Whether for themselves or the client is unclear. One side result of the limited feeding patterns of Gestalt, since the therapist can only work with material he can name and with polarity structures he is familiar with, is a cloud of unconscious material left in the field after feeding, stirred up by the structure-breaking behavior. In a training group, this will tend to ground itself through polarizing and confrontations between group members, or, in the case of one-to-one therapy, will reform into new energized structures, the energy often an angry one. As an aside, the whole of Gestalt is based on a lack of respect for process. It is the self's role, self with a capital S here, to govern process in the unconscious, which is paralleled by the mind's semi-apprehension of that process in the conscious. The Gestalt therapist wrenches formative energies from other levels of the psyche, which do not have a consensus time base, and pins them down in the here and now. Also, there is an accent on catharting, which denies the transformative potential of the client's material and is usually a waste of energy building up for transformational purposes. There is an avoidance of staying with the energetic emergence, often uncomfortable in its own time frame. The decision or willingness to sit with is lost. Nearly done. The adult Gestalt therapist has usually grown from a little scientist who, lacking a feeling connection with life, might be imagined picking a spider apart to find life, who now becomes a Dr. Frankenstein, piecing together the bodies of others to create a life. Handicapped by mainly operating on a cognitive level, many experiments are needed, and of course it's their own body or psyche that actually needs the work. One could also see them as coming from little detectives in a sort of whodunit. Who killed off their connection with their authentic selves, and where's the body? Since the investigations take place outside of the crime, the therapist's own psyche, no satisfying denouement is possible. They are stuck as investigators, but with the bonus of egoic or superegoic power that comes from that role. The vampiric feeding of the predatory therapist usually leads to the establishment of a herd or practice of farmyard culture clients. It often happens that the vampire's bite will lead the client to become one of the undead themselves, having lost their own soul in the process and being confirmed that the way to find life is in others, not in themselves. Note: soul retrieval. In shamanic practice, the journeyer searches for lost aspects of his client's soul parts in himself, his own inner realm. Also, matching up process at the beginning of a session, like matching tarot cards. If card is like a file heading, then the therapist uses the match as a means of empathic access to the client's material. So that's what I found, and one or two words I'm not very clear of, like retroflective, but it must have meant something to me at the time. And at heart, what do I think now, nearly 30 years later? Do therapists sometimes fill in the gap with a lack of connection with themselves, or a lack of mastery of themselves from the point of view of being a self at the centre of their own psyche by exploring other people's issues? Yes, sometimes. And sometimes therapy is good, and it's not about feeding. I suppose my last word is, because this is being recorded during lockdown at the beginning of 2021, I do wonder sometimes, working as a group facilitator and seeing clients, whether working with clients, with groups or individuals, does fill some gap that's otherwise missing during lockdown, and that certainly seems worth exploring. So there you go. For what it's worth, I'm going to send it off into the ether, or internet as it's called, and for somebody to laugh at or agree with or pick apart themselves. Thank you very much. Bye.